Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. So today we are going to discuss our next topic. And today is the second last lecture for this semester or for this course. Let's begin with land acknowledgement. I would like to begin today's session by land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we are gathering, most of us we are right now, on the traditional unceded territory of Coast Salish peoples. Our SFU Burnaby campus is located on the unceded traditional territories of Coquitlam, Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As Canadians, we must acknowledge that our country was built on the legacy of colonization, racism, displacement of Indigenous people. Before I move forward, today's session is kind of very important because it integrates our contemporary context and particularly what has been happening in the past few weeks around us. So in that sense, I think it would be super applicable to you in many ways, but also know that I myself am not super aware of Canadian context. So based on my own cultural heritage and my background, I might not be very well aware of many of the issues. So please stop me and correct me and engage in these conversations so that we can all learn from each other. So moving on. So our today's topic, as you can see over here, it's sustainable happiness, materialism, connectedness to nature, and well-being. So in this topic, we are going to cover multiple concepts, but more in an applied and also in a global development context. Particularly, we'll be focusing on how materialism has been seen in the sustainable happiness research, and particularly when it comes to environmentalism and climate-related changes that are happening around us, how our connection to nature has been disrupted, and hence also our well-being has been disrupted over the years. So first of all, before we start discussing what sustainable happiness is, what we mean by that, it is, I think, equally important that we also discuss what happiness is, how it has been defined in psychology, and why do we need to talk about sustainable happiness when it comes to environmental issues or issues related to global climate change. So in particular, it's important that we talk about sustainable happiness because it's a concept where we think about issues related to connection with nature and also sustainability in a way that our behavior and our well-being is motivated by how we connect or disconnect from the natural environment that is around us. Also, in multiple sectors, particularly when it comes to policy making, when it comes to environmental issues, sustainable happiness is one of those modern concepts where we have integrated our environmental issues into our happiness. And again, it's not a very linear relationship. There are multiple moderators, there are multiple income-related or socioeconomic status of different nations and countries that impact our sustainable happiness. So how does all of that happen? I think it's important to discuss that there are two key questions that we always need to answer when we talk about what is there to sustain and what is it that we want to change or what we want to modify. So first of all, when it comes to sustenance of happiness or sustenance of like sustainable modes of living in a way that makes us happy, we need to think of what social conditions will best promote human well-being, human welfare, and sustainability. In particular, when we talk about human needs, we need to think about meaningful living is always embedded, at least in the typical terms of positive psychology, environmental psychology. We are deeply linked, and on an intrinsic level, we do have this motivation, which is also based on several evolutionary reasons, that we always tend to look at nature, what nature has to offer us, and how we can strive meaning and well-being while being connected with the nature. So throughout this lecture, these are two questions that we'll try to answer in this session. So why sustainable happiness became a construct or a very important concept in the modern day development studies, particularly when it comes to economics or various indicators of the UN platform, or when it comes to sustainability or ecological footprint of people. So it all began in 1987 when Bertrand Commission published a report which was focused on understanding what are our common goals for being happy. And the report was actually called Our Common Future, as you can see over here. So in this report, it was the first report where this term or the terminology of sustainable happiness was used. And in particular, they focused on the fact that development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, that would be sustainable happiness. Also, you might have heard this term plenty of times in COP26 in the past few weeks, because whenever we talk about sustainability, it is not going to be sustainability if we are not thinking about all the generations that still have to come and join our planet. So if we continue to think in terms of consumption patterns that we continue to have right now, so in the context of, let's say, Black Friday, or in the context of, I don't know, the other thing, it was I think Cyber Monday or something like that. So if we continue to increase our ecological footprint on this planet, we can have a very, let's say, so to say, happy life. But what about all the life that still has to come on this planet? Humans, all the other biodiversity that exists, or much of it also has already extinct in many ways, that was already vulnerable. So in that sense, when we think of sustainable happiness, it's one of those concepts that has changed the way we think about our planet, and the way we have started to think that the resources on this planet, they are finite, they are not unlimited. So how to engage with those resources that we still live a happy life, or at least a satisfied life, but also all the generations that still have to join us, for them we leave just enough resources, or at least we create modules in our life that are more sustainable than what we are doing at the moment. So based on this commission's report and follow-up that happened in Rio de Janeiro and many other sustainability conferences, for the past 10 years or so, Sustainable Development Goals have constantly tried, or at least strived for, including sustainable happiness, which is not solely focused on the economic models or the consumption models, but also it focuses on sustainability in terms of retaining or sustaining our ecological environment, which is more happy and healthy, not just like humans, but also all the biodiversity that exists on our planet. In particular, when it comes to happiness, in the psychological terms, we have seen that multiple researchers, they have always defined it in a way that talks about appreciation of life. So for example, Ben Hoven talked about happiness in terms that the overall appreciation of one's life as a whole, in short, how much one likes the life one lives. So basically, the life someone is living, how happy or satisfied or appreciative of that life they are, that would be their happiness. But is this enough of an of a definition? Over the years in positive psychology, we have talked much more about the intrinsic motivations, why people need to think differently than we used to do. So in that sense, particularly the work from Seligman and colleagues, it really talks about that there are things that can inculcate authenticness in our happiness, or authentic living will create more sustainable happiness. And of course, in positive psychology, the work was not directly, at least not initially, it was not linked with environmental or climate psychology. But more and more new interventions that are being developed in positive psychology, they talk much more about enduring experiences of happiness. For example, some of the recent studies in positive psychology, they indicate that we are not telling you to stop buying or to stop um, experiencing anything that makes you happy, but what kind of intrinsic motives you associate with that buying or with that experience, and how you translate that materialism into some kind of experiential learning or experiential living, which is enduring experience wise, that is going to create much more authentic happiness. Also, it doesn't have to be like, large scale happiness or survival or existential questions that are only going to be answers for the kind of living we have, or the kind of experiences we want to make, but it can be as small as daily or very small experiences that we make. So for example, if you drink coffee or if you like coffee, there are multiple ways you can think about that coffee, or there are multiple ways of thinking or buying the clothes that you sort of like. For example, like, what are the sources of those productions, how the communities that produce those clothes, how they are treated, what kind of compensation they get. So all of this, like, green economies, or thinking about how even in your buying or in your consumption, how you can help or facilitate those who are in the underserved communities. So all of that is connected deeply with our nature and how we spend time in buying, consuming, or exploring different experiences. So in that sense, I think the way at least UN development's programs on sustainability or sustainable development goals, they have impacted generally our communities. I think it's really remarkable, because all of us, we have started to think of planet, at least the communities, if not the global leaders, in a sense that we are all connected, and how to empower other communities rather than just thinking about how we can be served by these communities. So on the same level, there is this really interesting report which every year talks about which countries are the happiest countries. So how much of this reported happiness is actually sustainable? So I'm sure all of you have seen this in positive psychology, or probably in some other courses, that all of us as people from developed countries, we generally take a lot of pride in the fact that, oh, we are the happiest countries. So if you look at, let's say, Canada, North America generally, or Western Europe, or Northern Europe, Scandinavia, or even Australia, most of the time we are pretty good at, like, ranking very high on the top of these lists. And as you can see over here, the green, or like, the deepest green is Scandinavia, and then, like, other shades of green, like these are well-to-do countries, and then the lighter these shades get, the countries are actually doing much worse on the happiness or life satisfaction reports. And even in these reports, when we look at these reports, these are mostly very much self-reported measures. So if you go out and ask people how satisfied you are with life, we as humans are really good at even sometimes deceiving ourselves that, well, we are doing pretty well. And not just the fact that, like, these are measurement issues, but also the fact that when we determine such indicators, we are usually looking at one or two scales or orientations based on which we are determining that these countries or our countries are happier countries. But is this a true story? Wouldn't it be a better measure if we also include for what kind of equalities, inequalities, materialism, and, like, all the other range of social and inclusion variables that might exist? So thinking of that, globally now we have a new movement where we don't just talk about, oh, how happy these countries are, but we try to look for more elaborate determinants of our happiness or our satisfaction with life, or general other variables. One such study, which is done globally almost every year for the past pandemic, for the past 2 years, we just had data from 2019, which was analyzed and presented in 2020, but for 2021, we still don't have the data for this. But in this one, as you can see over here, so you would see that, okay, if here we have the national income per person, which means that, like, the gross national income per person annually, if people make this much money, let's say 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, so on and so forth. And if we put it against, like, not only just measuring, like, how happy people feel or how satisfied people feel, but we ask them, like, more specifically, very happy or quite happy, like, on that index from very low to high, when people report that. So what percentage of people would report that they're very happy or quite happy? You could see that, let's say, like, here we have relatively poorer nations, not like, all, but it's also still like, middle income countries, many of them. So for example, Russian Federation, Armenia, Moldova, and Bulgaria, and Romania, Ukraine, etc. But on the top, when we come here, we have countries that say Norway, United States, Ireland, Switzerland, Canada, Iceland, Denmark. So basically North America and mostly Scandinavia, right? Or even the UK. So in these kinds of measurement, you see, or like, the automatic understanding would be that, oh, well, yes, higher the income, people are reporting that they are quite happy. But also then, if we look at these countries, so for example, Tanzania, Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, these countries are not very happy, sorry, not very rich, but still they report quite a high or almost equal high level of happiness. So what is it? Is it just like, being rich that makes us happy, or being the societies that consume quite a bit, does that make us happy? Well, the story is not that simple. So if we move forward and if we look at um, the sustainable happiness, which is the index that has come forward in the recent years. This one is from 2020. And if you would like to read more about this, there is a link about this index, and you can actually pinpoint and you can color code and select countries, and you can play with this data set online. It's really interesting data set. So here you would see that the countries that we just saw, for example, Canada and the US, these were very happy, like, on the previous slide. But here, when it comes to sustainable happiness, we are actually scoring pretty bad compared to, like, some of the other countries, which are either not very rich or even very rich ones. So for instance, here, if we look at countries, for example, some of the South American countries which are not very rich. So for example, Mexico or Colombia, or even if we go here, let's say here, it's Thailand, or on the other hand, very rich countries, for example, Scandinavia, in particular Norway, they report very high scores on Happy Planet Index. So in Happy Planet Index, that is also another way of scoring how sustainable happiness these countries or the people of these countries have. So in this index, we can see that it's not just the income. So it's generally like, how these communities, these people, or the people who live in these communities, they associate themselves with the natural environment and the efforts they have done in order to conserve that natural environment. All of that contributes to sustainable happiness. But on top of that, the Happy Planet Index score, it also determines that how much people have negative impact on the ecological environment on which they exist. So in that sense, like, these countries, they're not that rich, but their climate impact is very little. I think in the case of Norway, you could say that it's a very small country. It's like, a population of roughly, I think, 5 or 5.5 million people, but no more than that. But when it comes to countries like Colombia or Mexico or even Thailand, these are massive countries with their massive populations. So it's neither like, that the financial aspect of that, nor it is just the availability of the green or the ecological environment. It's really the preservation of that environment on country level, and how much effort these countries are spending on making this place more livable place or keeping the planet happy. But also, I think we need to be mindful. We can't be like, too happy that at least some countries are doing well, and all of us, we need to do well. Even here, there is no highest impact. So this dark turquoise green color, you don't see anywhere. So even the countries that are doing the best, they could do much better, right? So in that sense, I think when we think about sustainable happiness, or when we think about sustainable contribution to our ecological environment, which like, as an outcome makes us happy, none of us is actually doing the best, which is possible. So another really interesting line of work that we have seen in the development and in also, like, this mean happiness scores that came from the work of Easterlin. Easterlin worked initially in the US and then also did long-term longitudinal studies on data sets that were coming from Japan and the US. So initially, the idea was that over time, when nations gets happier, so basically, now you are kind of like, if you were earlier poorer and then you're getting richer, it becomes easier for people to feel happier. But then Sterling had this great innovative idea of plotting the average happiness of one country from, let's say, 1992 every year till 1987. And in this, he saw that although the average income of this one nation, in this case, we are talking about Japan, so it was increasing. Literally every year there was certain increase, but over the time, there was really this, like, a flattening effect of this happiness. So this became the first round of studies where people started to think that, okay, well, we can make more money, but it doesn't mean that that money is going to be proportionally making us happier as well. So in that sense, it was a really remarkable data set that we could see that over time, even if our income is increasing, doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to be happier as well. So this is called diminishing returns. So over time, let's say if we take all the countries that are middle income countries and some of them who are making very less money, let's say, like, their average income or their national gross income is very less, and the others where it's a bit more money, because we are talking about developing countries, not the developed countries. So if we talk about them and if we try to plot happiness, this is what we are going to see. So with the very less money, people are, let's say, on reporting from 1 to 10 on happiness, people would report that, like, they are lower on happiness, and over time, when they have more money, you see that there is more happiness. But also it's interesting, if you see over here, for example, the slope of this graph is much higher. So you can see that here, like, when people are getting money from very low to a little bit higher, even in that lesser domain, people tend to be happier. But when it comes to higher amount of money, when people are already in a better profile socioeconomic status, or they're making more money, actually they're like, those effects of expedited happiness, they tend to diminish. So in that sense, I think it's super important that when we talk about sustainable happiness, we understand that happiness is not a direct effect of having money. Of course, when it comes to lower levels of money, or when people are in poverty, their misery or their difficulties, they are much higher. And of course, the experience of happiness is very low, or it's just not there. But once people have accomplished just enough money or more money, then those effects, they tend to diminish over time as well. So in this study, which was conducted by Howell and Howell in 2008, it was really interesting based on these comparison. When they compared this data set and they translated the same data set on the World Value Surveys, they saw that when it comes to poorest countries, so it's only, like, the dollar amount that people are earning, it leads to 10% increase in happiness, right? So that coefficient is roughly 10%. But when it comes to wealthier countries, that impact is very low. So because most of the people, they are doing relatively well. Of course, we will talk about the income inequalities and happiness inequalities within the developed world too later on. But just to give you an idea that within wealthy countries, it's only 1 to 3% of happiness that can be predicted from the dollar amount that people make or people earn. So in that sense, I think when we talk about happiness or sustainable happiness, we really need to tease apart how materialism is overrated generally, but the impacts of that materialism, they actually do not translate into as much of happiness as we think or as we give it credit for. So moving on, when we look at, like, some of the data, the same data of very happy to rather happy, in the same sense, over the years, let's say if we look at Norway, these orange bar at the top, so roughly, like, doesn't matter that people have gotten much more richer from 2000 on to 2014, but their index of happiness or the reported happiness in people, that has stabilized over time. So that hasn't changed. So probably if we had data from, let's say, like, 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, which we don't have from Norway, but if we had that data, we could have reported that, well, the country was earlier less happier, but after getting, let's say, up to 2000, this is the time when they got, like, all these big oil reserves listed as, like, added income to average household in Norway. So we see that in Nordic countries and also in Canada, so that is stabilized. So what happens inside every country, it's not usually discussed in these indices. So earlier I shared the link with you, so have a look at that, and you can actually select the countries of your own choice, and you can make interesting comparisons based on this data online. So in that sense, if, like, certain countries are getting rich over time, actually their happiness also tends to stabilize. But what does it exactly mean for all the people in that country? Because most of the time we are taking the aggregates or the averages of these data sets. But when we look inside these countries, the indices and, like, the revelations are really remarkable. And that's also the point of our presentation today. Another interesting data set that comes from the US, and this also, like, sees that data and the trends from 1972 till 2002. And here on the right, if we see that the capital or the GDP growth per person that people, the amount of money that people make, it is constantly increasing. So if we start from 1972, as you can see over here, it's constantly increasing. But if we look at the measurement of happiness, if we plot the same across these years, we would see that it has stabilized. It's really a flat line, but also it's lowering somewhat. So what does it mean? The more, like, richer we are becoming, we are actually not gaining the same increase in the level of happiness. So after a certain time, it's just going to be flat. So what's the point of all the consumption and all the things that we continue to do in order to feel that that is going to make us happy? In a similar way, it's not just the US, it's not just, like, the richer countries. So as I said earlier, the impact is much more for the poorer countries. But in a similar way, if you look at the GDP growth of the UK, this blue line, it's constantly increasing. But when we look at the life satisfaction, it's almost flattened. So essentially, it means that after a certain point, when a country becomes developed, people need to find more intrinsic ways of finding happiness and finding more sustainable happiness, rather than actually just looking at like, the average earnings of people, because after a certain point, that's just going to flat out. And I think in that sense, it also gives us a lot of meaning to think about our natural environment, our ecological impact on our planet. Because if we look at what we are earning or what we are making, or what, like, compared to our parents we are going to make, all of that kind of like, it flattens out our happiness or our satisfaction with the life. But if we are trying to find something more meaningful, it will provide us much more intrinsic, meaningful ways of finding or coping with happiness. Okay, so now let's think about home. So in Canada, over the years, if we look from 1945 up till 2000, we find that constantly over here. So if this is like, from a scale of 0 to 10, our happiness, then we see that from here, look, I mean, there is not much change that's going on. So I'm sure if there is like, a little bit of fluctuation over here, let's say in the 75, 80, 80s and in the 90s, probably there are like, good reasons there, what we discovered or what happened in this country that might have like, impacted those levels, but generally we haven't climbed above 8, right? So we started with roughly 7 or 6.5, and then we are just like, above 7, around 8 for the past, let's say, I don't know, 20 odd years, at least over here in this data set. So it's really interesting though, because if we look at the income levels have gone really high. If you look at this, or even with the contemporary data, if that is available, we would see that the average income levels, they have been rising, but our happiness after a certain point, that has become static and it's just there. So what do we learn from that? We learn that there are more complexities that are going on inside the societies, and we need to look at that too. So if we have to look at, and if we have to find out, let's say, what is the top 5% income share in Canada? So over the years, if we look from 1920 up till 2000, so the top 5% income share in Canada, it has reduced, let's say, from 40%. 40% means that, like, the income, the top 5% of the Canadian people who make most money, they hold on to, let's say, about 40%, right? So over the years it has decreased, but I'll show you later on, because in this study we had they had data only till 2000, but this has remarkably gone up. So here, for example, when people were happier, as we saw in the last slide, in the 80s and 90s, when people show happiness, probably the inequality in the society was going low for some reason. But then 2000 and onwards, there is another spike in the income share. So basically, the fewer and fewer people are getting hold of Canadian income over the years, which means that probably these are some of those reasons that, like, when societies become really rich and there is much more inequality, then it doesn't translate into the amount of happiness that we expect. So in a similar way, if we look at, let's say, yeah, this one we have just discussed. So this one. So if we compare the data from the Canadian context with the US context, and the white squares, they are for Canada, and the empty ones are for the United States. So as you can see, we really resonate very well with what happens in the US. So if we look at the income inequalities in our country, in our two countries, so we see that 0.1% of the people, they are actually, like, up till 2000, and again, as I said earlier, these numbers are just rising. So they have around 7 to 8%, and in some cases also 10% of the income of the country, which also shows that probably over time, when countries become really rich, within those riches, some components, or, like, some subsets within those populations, they get more hold of those incomes, which means that, like, if income is unequal, there is no sustainability, and nor there is any sustainability of happiness. So in the end, if we look at, like, in the same line of argument, if we look at the least wealth in any given country, and particularly if we compare it with the most wealth in any country. And in this data set, you can also look at this data set, which is from Oxfam organization. It's a British organization which does metadata analysis for some of these studies. So they found out that if we look at the combined wealth of the least wealthy people, and especially if we look at the 50% of the poorest people of the world, we would find out that their income is actually equal to very few percent of people. Can anyone make a guess? The poorest 50% of people, their income should be equal to how many percent or how many individuals? Anyone? Okay, 95%, 70%. Okay. 2%. Okay. Mm-hmm. Can we go lower? Anyone? 0.5. Okay. We started with 95, so yeah, we are doing very well in an opposite way. Anyone else? Lower than this? No? Okay, yeah, quite close. Navjeet, yeah. Okay, so let's see what it is. So it's not even percent, it's the 50% of the global poorest people. And again, we are not talking about just few percentages. We are talking about more than it's more than 6.5 billion people. So if we compare what they earn or the amount of money they have, that is actually equal to 26 people only. So it's not even percentages, it's just a few individuals. So yeah. Any thoughts on that? No? Yes, it is. It is. It's insane. Absolutely. Yes and no. So yeah, Sachin, this is a really interesting question. It's 26 people globally. So unfortunately, I mean, even more unfortunately, some of the richest people also happen to be in some of the poorest countries. So if we look around, it's not just people in the richest countries. Of course, some of the richest people, everyone knows on their fingertips, but some of the very rich people, they also come from some of the poorest countries in the global south. So the income inequality, it's just, I think it's shocking. It's mind blowing. Yeah. So yeah, moving on. So then I think the problem with the inequality, and particularly with income inequality, is that it doesn't only stay with income, but it only gets worse with multiple other indices. Let's say we think about any kind of social problems, we can easily associate it with how unequal a country is. So if we look at this data set that came Spirit level in 2009, we see that, let's say, if the US is, of course, one of the highest income inequality country, but also one of the richest countries in the world. And if we compare that with kind of the index of health or social problems, in which we have life expectancy, health and literacy, infant mortality, homicide, and all kinds of social issues, going up to as normal issues as social mobility, which should be everyone's right if if we are living in equal countries. But the problem is that the income inequality, it's actually inversely it's directly, related to the social problems. The higher the income inequality, the higher the amount of social problems that country is going to have. And in a similar way, if we look at Canada, we are roughly moderate. Of course, we are still very unequal country in the context of, let's say, if we compare ourselves with Scandinavia and many other Western European nations, and also in the context of Japan. Japan happens to be one of the very equal countries, and also the collectivistic values that translate into really interesting social indicators for safety and many other social and health related indicators. Other than Japan, it's all just the Scandinavian countries, so Norway, Sweden, Finland, etc. So that, I think, when it comes to the climate related changes or environmental problems, one basic issue that we need to resolve for that, and for that I think we need a lot of activism on these aspects, which is related to income inequality. And I think I mean, all of you might be very young at that time, but since the Wall Street movement started, take down the Wall Street and the fight against 0.1% or 1%, I think all of that is deeply rooted in the sense of inequality that people perceive. And until we are very unequal and we continue to give leverages and buyouts to all these rich people who are, I don't know, developing all these mass scale development for their own personal financial and other kinds of growth, we are not going to be able to resolve social problems or environmental problems. So the income inequality that persists in developed nations and also in the underdeveloped nations, I think that is deeply embedded with our struggles for not being able to fight against climate change. And again, whenever we think about most of the good debates that come on income inequality, on the social development, they always end up coming from these Scandinavian countries, because if the nations are equal, it's easier for them to strive for the bigger, more meaningful deals in the world. But if you are just stuck in a lot of inequality, it's much harder for us to cross that barrier of basic income inequalities. And also now in the experimental economics and in the behavioral economics research in social psychology and experimentation, we are continuously finding out that through our experiments, if we reduce the more inequality we create in our experimental conditions, there is much less trust. And again, when there is no trust in societies, it's going to be much more harmful. And again, the same indicators you could see over here. If you interact with someone in Norway or in Sweden or in Japan, you would see how much trust people have in their governments. And because that social hierarchy for respectability might vary a lot, but when it comes to income inequalities, it's not going to be pronounced, because it almost doesn't exist. And in fact, in some of the Scandinavian countries, if you are if you are seen as an unequal person, or let's say if you are living in a neighborhood where you are able to flash something which is expensive, people are actually going to be very offended and they will show disrespect to you. So in that sense, I think depending upon where we are in the world and how equal or unequal our financial systems are, it has an impact on our well-being, our society's well-being, our community's well-being, and also generally then on our global and our ecological environment. I think one great thing that Canada has been able to do over the years is that they have started to integrate some of the indicators of well-being into different well-being indices that Canada has developed, particularly one that is being worked on in here at University of Waterloo. Here we have seen that multiple dimensions have been developed. So for example, healthy populations, environment, or community vitality. So these kinds of indicators that were earlier not one of the key part of our different development related indices, now our economists are actually doing a good job in working with psychologists, social scientists, and people like us, and talking and figuring out what kind of indicators, domains, and dimensions would be much more important and helpful for our development as a country, and making this country more equal. I don't know how that will happen, but at least theoretically and empirically, there has been some work that's going on. But if we look at these indicators, let's say we think about the Canadian Wellbeing Index, and we do have, let's say, healthy population, we have environment, we have democracy, and also then education and living standard. I think this is one of those domains that we need to really improve when we talk about Canada as being one of the richest country oil-wise or money-wise, and doing many other mining projects. So what is it that's missing from here? Any guesses? Any guesses, people? Yeah, I know, Daniel, that's really wild. Yeah. Yeah. Elena, yeah, that's a good guess. Yeah. Priya, yeah. So it could be spirituality, it could be gender. Yeah. What else? Mental health. Yeah. Caste and class. So there is something that is common in all of these dimensions. What is it? So let's say if we talk about gender, if we talk about spiritual element, could be well-being or mental health or class and caste, there's one element which is common in all of these. Identity, yes. Culture, yes. Inequality, yes. Yes. So basically, when we look at the indicators for the well-being, or when we look at multiple ways of looking at well-being across our data sets, especially when we work with social scientists, inequality is one of those constructs on which we did not have much work. And when we talk about gender, when we talk about class, when we talk about the well-being perspectives, there are two main components that always impact them. So the first one is, of course, income-based inequality. But what does it translate into? It formulates our identities in different ways. It impacts our well-being in different ways, because if I'm rich or if I'm poor, depending upon the financial assets that I have or what I can afford, I'll be able to either get no access to mental health or well-being counseling services, or I will have access to everything what I want. But also there is another essential element. Remember when we were talking about Bolivia, or when we were talking about Colombia or Thailand or Norway, in these countries, the ecological impact, it's directly related to the inequality, because these countries happen to be relatively more equal. There are relatively fewer caste systems. Ecologically, they are closer to the environment. So they're less materialist, and they're also less unequal. So equality is higher and materialism is lower, and that leads to a very interesting combination or a set of variables, which translates into really interesting things. So for instance, when we think about sustainability related challenges to our well-being, two main or the key components. One is related to the notion that we can't always have a lot of economic growth, and that economic growth, even if we get to that point where we have a lot of money, it doesn't ensure that it's going to be equal. So if something is unequal, we are not going to be able to retain that sustainability in our social and economic development. And the second element is about consumption. So as we just saw with, like, Black Friday, and everywhere around you, you get a lot of messages and advertisement that is focused on buy this, buy that, as if buying is something that is going to make us happier. So the biggest challenge that we see to our sustainability, or the sustainability of our happiness, these are two. The first one is inequality, and the second one is consumption. And again, if you think about it, both of them, they are connected. So who creates unequal environment? It's not the poorest people of the world who make their societies more unequal. There might be some default that has been embedded in the different caste systems and whatsoever, but even those caste systems, they are based on the inequalities that were prevailed by the richest people of those countries, those nations, or those communities. But when it comes to materialism is something that directly translates into more and more inequality. So for example, how decorated your house is at Christmas, or how many presents you get or you are able to buy to people. So what kind of meaning we can draw from that? Of course, like, for our families, the connectedness, the happiness that we draw out of that event, meeting, or like, eating with them, that's a different story. But over time, we have been, so like, if you go and watch TV for next 10 minutes, you would see probably like, 3 to 4 minutes of advertisements where you will be told that buying or selling, or like, getting diamonds make your relationship better, or buying expensive presents on bigger sales is going to make you happier. So all of these like, inequalities or materialism related associations, they kind of create confusion for the general consumers. So as psychologists, as social psychologists, or as people who are concerned about well-being, it's very important to kind of like, debunk these myths that media is trying to throw at us, right and left, and like, just all around us. So in that sense, I think these two challenges are the grave ones. If we really want to resolve the issues related to sustainability or unsustainable living, we really need to think about our consumption patterns and the inequalities that prevail around us. And sometimes I think unknowingly also we become part of these inequalities when we go around and we try to, like, throw bigger birthday or Christmas parties than other people. Probably we are becoming part of the problem than becoming part of the solution. So again, I'm not saying that, like, don't be happy, but try to find more meaning in that happiness if possible. So the other components, the other kind of research that we have seen coming forward from the work on materialism and social inequality, it shows that when people value money and material wealth a lot more, their happiness is kind of like, undermined. But it doesn't stop there, but it also makes people more depression or anxiety oriented. And again, like, in some cases around the world, people might have, like, genuine issues with anxiety and struggles with depression, etc. But generally, it's the consumption and the materialism also which contributes to such kind of poor mental health indicators for people. And again, there is now a lot of research that is coming out of psychology, and also a lot of marketing and consumerism oriented research that indicates to the point that it's not the materialism that is going to make us happy. But more importantly, we have also seen that over time, when people consume more or when they're engaged in materialism, it also creates a disparity in their social relationships. So for instance, if people are buying more, other people in their social circle or in their community, they would either be jealous or they will feel bad or worse about their own socioeconomic conditions. So based on these analysis, on these research, researchers have found found that it's not just like, the income inequality that prevails through materialism, but also like, the inequality or the worsening of our social relationships over time. That's something that is deeply embedded in materialism. And I think if we think back about all that research that we were talking about earlier, that after certain point, we see that our income doesn't contribute to our happiness. It kind of makes sense because, to a certain extent, when people are poorer, it would be helpful for them to have some fancy things in their life, or some a better quality of life. But after that is attained, it becomes really harder to propel their happiness beyond from that point. Also, we know that materialistic goals, they tend to be never ending, the sense of always needing more, which may create more inequality and materialism that continues to exist. And we tend to find that quite often in social psychology research on social inequality. Another interesting research, which I particularly find super interesting, it came from the lab of Liberman and colleagues, and they found out that just priming a certain kind of mindset among people when they are playing a prisoner's dilemma game, which is a game of basically cooperating or not cooperating, and where you can actually make non-cooperation sort of incentivized. So in this game, they found out that when they gave instructions to people and they were playing the same game, but they told them either they are going to play a community game or they're going to play a Wall Street game. So just being in that mindset, they saw that people were kind of most likely to cooperate. So for example, over here, when they had the nomination status of community game, people try to overall cooperate much more compared to when they were basically for example, told that they are going to play a Wall Street game. Similarly, in the overall cooperation, we saw that whenever the priming was of the community game, people were more able to, or they were more willing to cooperate compared to when their overall priming was based on the Wall Street. So this is basically the analysis of the first round of cooperation. So as you might know, when prisoner dilemma games are played, you play in rounds. So for example, usually what happens is that people in the first round might not be aware of what they're playing, what the game's rules are, and over time they also tend to understand it better. So in the behavioral economics and in the social psychology's behavioral economics research, we find out that over time, things might change when people tend to learn their game better. So it's not just because people just started to play and that's why they're cooperating less or more, but over time. So usually when we are playing prisoner's dilemma games in the economics or social psychology labs, we are giving them multiple rounds, sometimes 10 rounds, sometimes in 20 rounds. So most of the time, people would cooperate more when they are primed with the sensibilities of community-related games or cooperations, compared to when they are primed with business-related orientations. So overall, it was really an interesting and breakthrough experiment that you don't need to be in that unequal environment. It's just that mindset, or that thinking about certain kind of mindset, that's going to prime you with much more tendency to cooperate or to defect on people. So if we think about more recent research in psychology about thinking about money. So the previous research was more about thinking about the business or the game that was more of let's say community game or with a Wall Street game. But if we move forward and we think about some of the research that has been based on money, whenever participants were primed with money, or they were asked to think about money, they actually were less helpful to other people in the experiment or to the Confederates. They were less likely also to ask for help, right? So people, so somehow money is something that lowers your empathies. Again, like, there might be some extraordinary example that many rich people could be very good at philanthropy. The reasons could be variant. For example, someone is trying to evade the tax or whatsoever. But generally, we have seen that when we prime people with money, there is less cooperation generally, as we saw in the last research. But particularly, like, when it comes to empathy-oriented variables, there are really clear results. They do not want to identify. So probably, like, money is something that prevails that more inequality mindset in people, and people are more willing to self-identify as more individualist, or like, people who are more independent. They don't need to think about interdependence, or like, their need to affiliate or identify with others is also compromised because of that. And similarly, as we just saw in the last research, whenever people are primed with business attire, business mindset, that also means that will translate into less cooperative mindset. Particularly this research by Kay and colleague, it was really interesting study where when the participants were either given a very neutral attire. So for example, they were given a regular pen, a regular bag, and they had to just carry those things, they had to interact with those objects. And in the second, or the experimental condition, the participants were given a leather bag and a very business oriented look. So people who were given this business attire, they were actually less willing to cooperate with others. So in that sense, it shows that probably people who are trained very well in banking sector, or working in Wall Street or any other stock exchange, or those places where they're constantly primed with these indicators of money, it probably compromises their sense of cooperation, or it somehow lowers their empathy, or their desire to affiliate or identify with other people. So I think it's a really also interesting way to think about when we interact with other people, what kind of attire people wear, what kind of body language people have. So are they all tight and toughen up, or in their fancy boots, which, or with their fancy leather bags, which are very business oriented attire and mindsets that might be promoted through that. So I think it's really important to indicate that just the priming of money, or just thinking about money, or just interacting with a few things, if that makes people so indifferent, so independence oriented, then how can we expect people who are billionaires or almost trillionaires in the world, why would they step forward, and why would they try to cooperate with us when it comes to climate related, environmental, or social inequality related struggles that our planet is facing at the moment? So at the end of the day, I think our governments really need to intervene, and our people really need to move forward with some kind of activism and some kind of social fight for these issues. Because otherwise, if priming of money can be so powerful, imagine having money would be extremely powerful. And that's why people are not willing to give up on all of those amazing things and amazing opportunities they have created for themselves. In a similar way, social sciences research, and particularly in social psychology, we have found that social class and good behavior, they don't always go together. So people who are from the much higher socioeconomic status, or people who haven't seen much of mobility in their life from lower or middle socioeconomic status to higher, they tend to be less generous, they tend to be less trusting, they tend to be less helpful and less compassionate. And I think this sums up the personality of many billionaires we see around us, like, in the media world and etc. They are worse in empathic accuracy. I'm not sure how many of you watch different series on television or on other spaces, for example, on Netflix. But if you generally analyze the characters in different shows, you would see that also I think media is very good at projecting that many of billionaires or very rich people, they might not be very good at empathizing with people or accurately picking on emotions of people. So that's quite interesting, I think, as a social scientist or as a researcher for us. Also, they tend to be less collectivistic, and I think we have seen the reasons for this in the previous research, that money does something to you that promotes more independence, that promotes more self-focused identity rather than affiliating with other people. So it's also very interesting that if we look at the real-time like class differences, social class differences, all of this is very visible to us. But in addition to that, when we look at some of the research that is coming from just priming the social effects of, or the manipulating the subjective sense of social class. So if there are people from the similar backgrounds and you take them to a social psychology lab and you prime within them a different or a worse or a better sense of social class, they will also tend to show you all these differences. So again, I think this proves the point that if just priming the social class or the higher social class or more money is going to lead to such significant effects, then we need to expect that this is how the rich of the world are, and this is how they are going to prevail that inequality, which essentially means that we need to work together with our governments towards breaking these barriers down and trying to understand better what is it that we need to do in order to break these circles of inequality. In addition to that, there is also closer to home, more interesting empirical data that also shows that the ecological footprint of Canadians is also showing these kinds of impacts. So for example, if we look at these, these are the decals. So basically we have 100% of population. And if we look at the lowest percentage of the population, which is let's say the lowest 10%, which means the people who are the poorest people, and the highest 10% is the people who are the richest people in Canada. So if we look at their ecological footprint, you would also see that this inequality by default tells them to consume more. So with literally every higher decile, you would see that people are consuming more. And then now guess what the last 10% of the people are going to be. So on average, it's almost double than what people, or almost 3 times compared to what people in the lower deciles would do. So essentially, people then also probably feel more entitled, and just having that surplus money, having those resources and that sense of independence or experimentation, that allows them to have much higher ecological footprint. So imagine if we kind of make these people more equal to these people, probably we'll have a better ecological impact on our soil or on global soil. So in that sense, I think poverty is not the culprit in the world. It's basically the richest or the richest people of the world, or those 26 people of the world, who probably have the highest impact even compared to these state level numbers. So if we move forward and look at the equality and environmental stress across the 50 states in the US, this is also a very interesting data set that comes from the US, where what they do, they tend to measure the stress, the environmental stress that is created by each state. We are not going to talk independently about each of the state, but just to give you a flavor. So if we look at the greater economic and political equality, if let's say the states are more equal, which is going towards the 3, and if the states are, let's say, less equal, which is, let's say, going over here, we see that there is higher inequality, which will translate into higher environmental stress. And if there is lower inequality, that will translate into the lower environmental stress. And again, environmental stress is similar to what we do with ecological footprint of people. So overall, the states which are most equal, they have sort of lowest impact, and the states that are most unequal in their economic or in all the other indicators, they would also have the highest impact. And again, I think if we just take these two data set together, we can really see that the richest people, they are consuming more, they have higher ecological footprint, they create a higher level of stress for the environment in which they live in. So what do we need to do? I think if we want to resolve our social problems, if we really want to resolve our economic problems, or environmental or climate related problems, I think before anything else, we need to think or talk about the equality, the social inequality. And it's not that it's such, again, it might be a hard job to do, but it's not that impossible. So for example, in several countries, particularly in Norway, and in many other places, at least I'm more aware of the Norwegian context, where every year your annual income, it is declared, and there is a website where every Norwegian, they can log into that website. If they are part of the Norwegian system, they're able to see the average income earned by XYZ individual. So in that sense, I think that transparency, it's only possible when we live in an equal society, and when we are able to ask for such kind of information. So for example, let's say if I'm living in the US or in Canada, there are certain individuals, I would like to know their income and the amount of tax they pay. So I think in order to create more equality, we also need more transparency in our countries. In a similar way, if we look at, for example, this data set from the this one is, let me just see, I want to reflect a bit on this data set. Yeah, so I just want to clarify that these states which are at the lower impact, these are the green states in the US. So for example, California or Oregon, so these are the states where you see that there are constant policy struggles, where people are trying really hard to make sure that there is more prevalence, or at least there is more conversation around equality. Yeah, okay. So in a similar way, when we think about the global inequality, in the global income inequality, if we see that, again, as I just said, that in countries such as in Finland, in Norway, in Sweden, or in Denmark, we see that the environmental compliance score is much higher, which means that these countries are actually equal. And because of that, they are also equally able to contribute to environmental compliance, because the countries are transparent. So for example, not only I'm accountable as a citizen to the government, but also the government is accountable to the citizens. So what kind or what percentage of the economic or the social resources is going to the environmental compliance, all of that is much more openly available. But when it comes to countries like ours, we kind of fall somewhere over here, or around over here. But when it comes to countries, for example, the US, again, these are the countries with very high income inequality, and in the same fashion, they're not able to comply openly with the environmental compliance protocols, globally speaking. Also, I think this is a very interesting data set. Unfortunately, I didn't find data on Canada in here, but it was really interesting to see that income inequality is also an indicator of the lower recycling rates. So as you can see, this is kind of the rank order data. So the lower is the rank, it means that the countries the highest in recycling. So for example, Japan, Sweden, Germany, Switzerland, these are the countries that are highest in recycling. On the other hand, when it comes to very unequal countries, for example, the UK or the US, Portugal or Australia, we see a lower amount of recycling. So again, if we really want to move more towards sustainable living, sustainable happiness, we really need to cut this inequality out of our social lives and our political lives. So before I stop for questions and answer in this session, I would really like to conclude with Boyce's word and a lot of interesting work on inequality or social and environmental inequality has come from Boyce. And in this work, the message or the general message is that how we treat the natural environment, it depends on how we treat each other, right? So if we are going to be unequal, the impacts or the environmental hazards and everything, of course, that's also going to be unequal. Just look around you, and even during the recent floods, people who are probably some of the poorest farmers or some of the poorest people in our province, they were the ones who were hit the hardest in these floods. So all the social and environmental inequalities, they translate into the more devastating impacts for the communities that are underserved or the communities that are the weakest links that we have. So I think it's super important that when we talk about environment, we talk about inequality, because one issue that can resolve many of the other problems that we have, be it social, environmental, or mental health related issues, they are deeply embedded in inequality. And at the core of all of that is the social inequality that prevails around us, and that our governments and our social and environmental and even financial institutions, they continue to push forward. So it's an important breakthrough that now we know what is it that we need to fix, and how we can become happy through fixing all of these issues. Yeah, so with that, I think I would take a short break, and if there are any questions, yeah, please ask them now. Anyone? Yes, I heard. Go ahead.
Hello, I was just wondering if you're holding office hours tomorrow, Tuesday.
Yes, I am. From 1 till 3 p.m.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Okay, no questions. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I think these are such important things to talk about. I know it's inequality is one of those things which is really hard to talk about, but I think this is one issue we really need to talk much more. It doesn't matter if we are talking about mental health, environmental health, or our own well-being and happiness. Social inequality is at the core of it. And I think I really wanted to combine some of the text from the ecological impacts and how our environment helps us in being or staying happy, and then also what kind of impacts inequality has on our climate and on our communities. So I think it was a nice way to combine both of them. Okay, if there are no further questions, let's take a 15 minutes break, and then let's resume at 4:05. Yeah, so it's 3:50 with me right now, and let's meet at 4:05. Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you are back from the break. So let's start with the second session. So in this part, we are going to cover two things. So the first one is going to be a bit more research about how noticing or being in nature helps us with our well-being. And the second part is going to be about our final exam. So let's start right from here. So when we think about some of the inequalities that exist in our society and how they hinder our well-being or the sustainability of our environment and our well-being, it's very easy to understand that, like, wealth, money, materialism, and all of that, it's kind of a hindrance factor. But then, if we really want to capitalize on our natural environment and on our communities, how can we help each other and also our environment? So, now in the past 10 years or so, there has been a lot of research that is indicating that noticing our nature, being in the nature and spending more time in the nature is something that helps us on individual level, and it has social benefits, which creates a community which is healthier community, which is more egalitarian community. And it's also one of the ways where we can cultivate biophilic communities, which means communities that are nature oriented, who love nature. And again, as I said earlier, as you will see later on as well, there is now a lot of research that indicates that spending time in nature is very helpful for our mental health and our well-being. So protecting environment is not just an issue of protecting the planet for us and also for the future generations, but also helping our own well-being. So if not for social or communal responsibilities, then probably even for our individual interests, we really need to protect, preserve, and respect nature the way it is, because we get everything we have from the nature. So, yeah. When we look at some of the work that has been done, particularly on looking at what existential threats are available to our living as human beings on this planet, there has been a lot of research that indicates that eco-existential positive psychology, meaning that the psychology that emerges from environmental sciences, how it has a very close link with positive psychology perspectives, and how it can help us in understanding and making meaningful and better relationships. So in that line of research, Passmore and Howell, they have actually multiple research. So this one came in 2014. There is another one. So this one is more of a theoretical perspective, where they talk about the fact that when we think about our anxieties, there are 6 existential anxieties. And as you know, the term existential anxiety, it comes from terror management theory mainly. But how does it collaborate with positive psychology? So in that collaborative sense, there are 6 identities around which a lot of our psychology or psychological needs work. So the first one is our need for identity. And as you can imagine, being a social psychologist and being a psychologist generally, we know that our identity or threat to our identity as human or as, like, dweller of this planet, it's one of the biggest existential threats that people have. The second part is more about, like, the notion that we want to be happy, and that anxiety that what if we can't maintain or have that happiness. The third existential anxiety is around isolation. So of course, being social animal, we really want to be connected or meaningfully connected with our communities and with our people. And if that is hampered, that isolation can become one of the largest anxiety for people. And then meaning of life or meaning in life, as you can understand from the positive psychology perspective, if materialism cannot make us happy, then the only alternate that we might have is the meaning in life, for example, that could be drawn from anywhere. So in our small scale consumptions, we could associate some kind of meaning that how we are facilitating other communities, or just like, fighting for climate, or participating in activism that ensures that we have some meaningful way of contributing to our communities and to our planet. And of course, like, it doesn't matter if we live in collectivist or individualistic cultures, our freedom or that threat to freedom can be one of the big existential anxieties as well. And again, mother of all existential anxiety, and I think we have seen that in Dr. Mudassir's talk as well, that the death primes, or just like, the mere association of death with degradation of our natural or environmental context, that can also prime a lot of existential anxiety. And I think it's also important to mention here that when we talk about climate change only in a sense that it's all doom and gloom, this is also the reason that mostly it is not helpful for us, because it doesn't get our word across when people are primed with these existential anxieties or threats to some of these core values or identities people want to have. It's harder for people to move forward and think about, like, other things. So if there is just doom and gloom, we can't make much progress with that. So for that reason, it's very important that we focus on meaning in life, or like, how we can associate with nature, what we can draw from nature, and how we can fight for that nature through that meaningful existence and participate in our ecological and sustainable well-being. So the next kind of like, follow-up work that was a combination of empirical and theoretical work, and I'll come to the empirical part of this work later on. There, Passmore and Holder, they extend this notion beyond this biophilia hypothesis, that in order to reduce our anxieties, we need to think more about, like, how nature can be helpful for us, or how we associate positively with the nature. So in addition to, like, this more biophilia oriented hypothesis, they propose that there are three alternate ways. The first one is attention restoration theory. So attention restoration theory, it mostly talks about how the natural environment, they're rich in stimuli that effortlessly engage our voluntary attention, which is also called soft fascination, which means that when we are in greener environment, they restore our well-being, they restore our attention, and that's very helpful for our happiness or sustained happiness. The second theorization, or the hypothesis, that we also earlier talked about a little bit, the biophilia hypothesis, it sets forth that we have an evolved inclination to affiliate with natural world and respond with emotional intensity to the non-human natural environment. So basically, our needs and our affiliations and our identities, all those anxieties, they can be kind of like, linked to the natural environment. So when we are in greener environment, or when we are in ecologically happy environment, that makes us happier. That kind of like, primes that basic evolutionary instinct of being in that green environment, because we have spent thousands and thousands of years in that environment, and the built environment is still a very new thing to us in the evolutionary perspective. And the last perspective is the eco-existential positive psychology perspective that we just shared. And it's really the perspective that proposes that cultivating our innate biophilic tendencies through environment with the natural world increases our well-being by helping us address our existential anxieties. And these existential anxieties are the same ones that we just discussed on the last slide. So this is basically like, when we cultivate this biophilic tendencies through exposure to nature and green experience, this can actually help us in addressing our existential anxieties, and particularly that sense of isolation that is reduced when we are in the natural environment. And that's why also you might have seen that when people are even alone in the natural environment, in a park or in a more wild environment, people do not feel very alone. So that connection with nature, it satisfies some of our missing connection needs as well. So environment or our ecological surroundings, they have a huge part to play when it comes to our anxieties. And you might have also noticed whenever we feel sad or depressed, we really want to reach out to a beach or to a park or any other natural environment because it relaxes us because of our evolutionary history. So and it's not just these arguments or these propositions that are theoretical, but also a lot of experimental research that has been done in the past few years. It shows that whenever we think or we are primed about the natural environment, it actually helps us, and it reduces our anxieties on multiple levels. One such research that was done by Passmore and Howell in 2014. This is not the theoretical research, this is the additional experimental research that was done by these researchers. They found out that when people were asked to spend more time either in the built environment, or they were asked to spend more time in the natural environment. So in this context, when people were reporting higher happiness, and when they were asked to give the qualitative complements, the data that could complement their experience of positive impact on their well-being, they saw that those positive associations, they were like this. So for example, when people were outside, when people were doing work in their garden, when they were in their backyard, or when they were walking, when they were let's say around a river, or when they were playing, or when they were in the sun or in the trees. So basically, and again, also when this is a qualitative analysis where these words, they are proportionately representative of the association with the happiness. So how many times the word backyard or walk or neighborhood came up in this study, that is proportionate to the representation in this figure. So basically we can see over here, if people who are the happiest in their study, if their key terminologies that we could associate with that positive well-being or positive impact, if they were more about outdoors or nature, then it shows experimentally also that people would be happier, or people would experience much more pleasant and positive impact if they are in the natural or in the green environment. So I think this, yeah, okay. And then following up that, in that previous research, they were only comparing the physical environment that was outdoors or the built environment. But here what they did, they actually went a step ahead. Here, instead of just doing two experimental conditions, they also did a control condition. In this particular study, Passmore and Holder, they actually tried to differentiate in a number of ways, particularly instead of going and asking people to go out and actually participate more in the physical environment or less in the physical environment, they focused on how we can just prime people with certain set of instructions to make them think more about the natural world. So for instance, what they did, they developed 3 conditions. One of the conditions was such that where people had to think that they had to keep their focus more on the nature. So they were told that whenever they're outdoors or in the next 2 weeks, they have to take only pictures of the natural environment. In the second condition, they asked them to take the pictures of the built environment. environment. And the third condition was where they were told that they can take pictures of any environment around them. So they very strategically developed these very smart, efficient ways of priming people constantly with nature, with built environment, or a control condition. So what they found in these studies that was really interesting, and the direct association, or the question that they wanted to answer through this experimentation or intervention, was that at the end of the 2 weeks, so the experiment ran for 2 weeks, they were actually just trying to figure out if priming nature, or that condition where people were thinking about the natural environment and taking pictures of natural environment, how that would affect them compared to all the other moderations. So for example, maybe people have certain tendency to spend more time in the let's say natural environment, or if people generally like to be more biophilic in these tendencies. So those variables they were controlled for, or they checked the moderation for that, meaning that would are these our natural inherent tendencies, or is it just the focus or the shift that we have from noticing the built environment to noticing the natural environment more? Is it that natural environments noticing that translates into our better well-being? So to answer that, when they analyzed their data, they saw that, so don't be scared of these numbers, but just look at this is the natural environment, which means that here they were looking at how when people were interacting with nature or taking pictures of pictures of nature, how their well-being was being impacted, and then the built environment when they were taking pictures, let's say, of home or the mall or wherever they were. And the third one was a control condition, of course. So as you can see over here, so this is a positive effect. This is the elevation, or that perceived positivity. This is the meaning in life, and this one is a general sense of connectedness, and this is the pro-social orientation, and this is the time that they had spent in each of these, natural environment, built environment, and the control. And again, please note that this is what is reported after they were part of that intervention. So they saw that the overall positive effect, which means that positive emotions that were reported by people, they were much higher in the nature condition compared to the built environment. And as you can see, the difference is huge. But the difference between the built and the control environment was not significant. Similarly, when we talk about elevation, the feeling of that heightened sense of perceptivity or happiness, that was much higher in the nature environment compared to the built environment or the control environment. And similarly, the meaning, the association with meaning, it was higher in the nature condition compared to the other two, and so on and so forth. And again, one thing that is super interesting in this data set, it's also related to the pro-social orientation. So people who were in the nature, they actually reported much higher pro-social orientation, meaning that they were more helpful to others compared to the condition where they were just taking photos of the built environment and or the controlled condition. But I think the most interesting part over here was that people were not asked to go out and spend XYZ time in nature. So as you can see over here, the difference in the time spent in the natural built or any general other environment, it's non-significant. There is no significance here, which means that doesn't matter how much time people actually spend in nature, but when people are primed with thinking more about nature, that already makes them happier. So then make the extend the assumption to the fact that when people are actually out there in that natural environment, then people would actually be much more pro-social. People will derive more meaning from that. People will have higher positive effect. People will have lower negative effect, and people will have higher association with the meaning. So again, it's completely opposite to the way how we think about materialism. We continue to think that materialism is something that makes us happier, but it actually makes us sad. And nature is something that we usually take for granted, but this is something that actually has much higher potential to make us happy. So I really admire this research. It's really wonderful way to think about just noticing nature, or just I don't know, having some interesting poster of nature or picture that you have took in the natural environment, posting it right on your desk might be really interesting and also helpful for you. Another interesting aspect in the study was that they also added some qualitative finding, where they found that when they asked people, when they think about what was it that made people kind of happier, when, or what they thought of thinking about all the picture that they had taken of nature. So the kind of terms that people describe, it was more about hope, peace, freedom, awe, or rejuvenation. So also, again, if you look at these terms, these are proportionate to the way people had reported these terms. Similarly, when people were asked to think and reflect on their built environment, these are the things or the words that came up much more. And as you can see, also the number of words were quite a lot, but it was more about annoying, or let's say the safety concerns, or even disgust, or stress, guilt, confusion, or even pride. Probably people had bigger houses or bigger things to be proud of, and again that shows the elements of social inequality, and also fatigue. So in that sense, you can see that the negative connotation, it's very prominent in this kind of research. Another research that came in 2016 by Gurgen and Stefan, this also showed that when people are interacting with the natural environment, and this was a really interesting study as a field experiment. What the researchers did, they put Confederates outside a national park. So when people were coming outside from the park after having long walk or whatever activities or hangout they were having in that park, when people come out of the park, they were much more supportive and pro-social, and they were more helpful to Confederate compared to when people were entering in the park. So basically, before getting exposure to natural environment, people were less helpful and less pro-social compared to when they came out from the park. So basically, if people are unhappy and if people are less helpful, we really need to send them to park. And probably most rich people wouldn't spend a lot of time in the park because they're too busy making money and making the world more unequal place. Another interesting study that I want to share before I close this session, it's about the use of transport or the walkability of places. Kahneman and Cougar, they did a research in 2006 where they worked with 900 female workers from Texas who were traveling every day to work. So depending upon if they were cycling there or if they were using their own means of transport. And just to clarify, around 2% of people, they either walk or they bike to their work in Texas. So around 98% of people, they use their own car. So in that context, the biggest stressor or the source of unhappiness that was reported by these women in their experiential sharing and also through their diaries, that was the source of commute. So I think the more time people are spending in their cars while traveling from place A to place B, it also makes them unhappy. Another study that was published by Statistics Canada in 2006, in the same year, it measured in Toronto, they measured that people who were using public transport to travel, or people who were walking to work or cycling, they reported higher levels of happiness. And again, this is not a causation, this is a correlational study, but these studies indicate how just changing our lifestyles to more sustainable ways can also make us happier. Another study that comes out of our Canadian context, that was the study on the Canadian Fitness and Lifestyle Research Institute, where they asked the youth to rate their quality of life. as compared to their physical activity levels. And they found out that the youth who was more engaged in physical activity, particularly outdoors activities, and the youth who was more engaged in spending time in the physical, in the natural environment, for example, walking, going to park and doing more physical activity in the parks, they reported higher and more sustained level of happiness compared to people who were engaged in lower physical activity or lower engagement with the natural environment. Similarly, I think more and more cities and communities in the world, they're trying to become more walkability friendly, because now we know that there has been plenty of research coming from elementary schools, coming from the other sources, where we see that people are happier, or for example, roughly 75%, one or three-fourths of the people, they prefer to walk and the cycle on more regular level, because their well-being is positively impacted by these activities in the physical and particularly in the natural environment. Similarly, now we are also seeing that globally people are focusing on sustainable happiness than just making bigger roads, wider roads. Two very prominent examples. One is from Bhutan, where instead of doing a GDP-based index, they are doing the world happiness. They are doing more national happiness index. So all their portfolio of research on well-being, it's really focused on the human well-being and the natural environment. Similarly, in Colombia, there has been a lot more of initiatives where they are trying to close the roads for cars one day a week, and now they're also trying to make the city more walkability friendly, which means that people are happier, people are healthier, and their happiness is more sustained. In a similar way, multiple communities in the world now, they're focusing on their children, and particularly UNICEF has this huge program where they are trying to increase the engagement of our youth in opportunities that are meeting our mental health and our health and environmental standards, in terms of transportation, in terms of connectedness, in terms of safety. So if our natural or the physical environment is more sustainable, it doesn't only make us happy, but also it makes us safe. So we need more and more policies that are sustainability and happiness oriented. One last thing that I want to share, and I find this very interesting, it's about that it's not just thinking about happiness from one year to another, but we also need to integrate these sustainable happiness protocols into children's education. And it's something that many countries are already doing. So for example, in Germany, in Australia, Denmark, and these are the top 10 countries where this has been integrated. We are still struggling, and we are not integrating sustainability into our education and into our educational lifestyle. But education doesn't have to be about kids or students being really struggling when they are trying to grow from childhood to the youth, but it also has to include a component that makes them more aware of the natural environment and how the natural environment can actually make them happier. And we have countries that can serve as example, and we can pick from them what they are doing and what's right for our children or for our future generations. And one really interesting quote I found from Nording's research was that happiness should be an aim of education, and good education should contribute significantly to the personal and collective happiness. And we can't do that without integrating our nature and our welfare programs into our education, because it's the first thing that we can do in order to create a more sustainable and an equal environment. Yeah. So to conclude, when we think of sustainability, we can't do sustainability on an individual level. We need to think about our communities. We need to drop this constant struggle and chasing the materialism that we are doing. Again, don't think that I'm some communist giving you all these ideas, but I think it's important to kind of find things that actually make you happy in more meaningful ways, rather than just thinking about the straightforward consumption-oriented spending of your life. And in addition to that, we need to be more mindful of what kind of behavior we have. They're deeply embedded in policy. So all the countries, for example, in Scandinavia and many other places, when we see people or the leaders that develop policies that curtail the top ending or who curtail the inequality, we see the impact in the happiness of their people and also the growth of their nation. So we can do the same, and we need to tilt our activism equally towards diminishing inequality as much as we have to talk about the ecological growth or biodiversity of our countries. And again, it's important for our security, for our planetary security, for our mental health and well-being to be more sustainability oriented, and only then we can find sustainable happiness. And lastly, I think it's a great purpose that sustainability and happiness are combined, and they are finding out all these connections, how our well-being is deeply embedded and should be focused on sustainability, because without that we can't foster any kind of sustainable and meaningful behaviors and meaningful changes in our planet and into our communities. So with that, yeah, these are the references for this presentation. And if there are any questions, I would like to address them. And then for the last, I think, 15 minutes, I would like to go to our discussion on final exam. Yeah? Any questions? Anyone? So I have been really clear, or it was a lot to take in. Okay, so if there are no questions, I would move to the next phase. So, yeah. So regarding your final exam, so here is the format that we are going to use for our final exam. So as you all know, your final exam is going to be on December 11th, and it's going to be between 12 and 3 p.m. Please know that it doesn't mean that our exam is for 3 hours, but this is the time, within that time frame our exam has to run. Overall, our exam will be of 2 hours. I'll keep it open for 3 hours because sometimes, someone might be having some issues in starting or just winding up their exam. So it will be open from 12 to 3 p.m. But once you start doing your exam, it will have only you will have 2 hours to attempt it. So that's the time frame that you will be given, 120 minutes. And also, please know that people who need special accommodations or who have already put up requests with CAL accommodations, or who have already told us or the TAs about different other accommodations, they will have approximately 3 hours. In some cases, there are cases, I think 1 or 2 cases where they will be needing a little bit more time based on the CAL accommodations. Other than that, the format of your final exam is going to be similar to your midterm exam, and the reason for that is now you are familiar and you know what to expect, how much to write, and what to write. So please use there will be only 3 questions, short questions. Each question will be worth 5 points. And please make sure to write roughly 3 paragraphs, which is 250 to 300 words. In addition to that, we'll have around exactly 20 MCQs. Each MCQ will be worth 0.5 points, and then that will compose around 10 points. So overall, our midterm is going to be 25 points worth. Please know that our exam is going to be open book exam, meaning that you can use the recorded lectures, the videos, or also slides or research papers. Everything will be available to you. So please make sure that you have reviewed all your resources, so that when you go to exam, if you have to find something, that should be available to you. And then also the exam is not going to be proctored, but it means that I'll be sitting on the email. Also in the Zoom, I'll be sharing a link. If anyone needs, if there is some panic or something, please reach out to me. I'll be there, and I'll be happy to facilitate you in any way possible. Then I see that there are a few questions in the chat. I'll come back to that. Just let me finish the last part of this one. So one thing that I think you have also learned from the midterm, and I would also like to reiterate, please follow the sequence on the canvas. The reason is that sometimes when we have our invited lectures, for example, when Dr. Madasar came, or when we had Priscilla or Maitland come in, sometimes we have to shift the topics, because when the guest lectures come, they bring their own topics and their own readings. So we have to move our contents from one week to another. So please make sure that when you are preparing for your final exam, you follow the modules as they are listed on your canvas. So for your final exam, we will have 6 modules that will be covered in that. The module number 8, module number 9, module number 10, module number 11, 12, and 13. So today we have completed our 12 modules, and the last lecture for this semester, and also my last lecture here, it will be next Monday. So please make sure that you have reviewed all the lectures, and all the links and the videos, they are posted on your module. So just review your module, all the readings. Please do them, but make sure that when you're looking at slides, the slides are usually for us as cues when we are speaking. Sometimes people make notes, but usually I don't make notes if I've done all the readings recently or in the recent days. So please make sure to listen the lectures, because you might have some indicators on the slides, and sometimes the point we want to make, that might be framed in an inverse way. So please make sure to listen to the lectures, so that you clearly know what we are asking and what we mean when we are asking a certain question. So these are the key advice. Also, I'll post these 2 additional slides on the exam in your module. Also, this session is being recorded, so please feel free to review this, so that you have everything available to you when you are preparing for your exam. So please unmute yourself and ask if you have any questions. Let me see. Okay, Elena. Yeah, I just saw your answer. Mohammed, no, so it's not cumulative. As you can see over here in the last slide, we are only going to have module number 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 for the final exam. The previous modules, the previous 6 modules are not going to be included in the final exam. If you would like to have them too, I'll be okay. I have plenty of questions, but I think you have other exams too. So let's keep it a bit simple, yeah? Okay, so yeah, so there is this question that why multiple choice is 0.5 and not 1 mark. The reason is that like, you know, then the stakes would be very high if we have like, you know, each question for 1 mark. That can be really high stake. And usually in the past few years, we have seen that students tend to do better if we have more questions and if they are low stake, otherwise they tend to do more mistakes. Yes, Daniel. Okay, thanks. Yes, Zachary, yes. So the final assignment, which is our extra credit assignment, which will be open for everyone and it's worth 3 points, that will be open next week. And the reason for that was that I could clearly see that, like, you know, 3 is an optimal mark that we can accommodate people if people would like to have those additional marks. So yeah, that will be open on Monday, and that will be open till yeah, so it will be open till like Friday, I guess, or maybe Thursday. I just don't want to like keep it open for too many days because I have to assess it, and also I want you to be focused on your final exam. Yeah. Okay, so Jacob, I'll have a look at that. I'll get back to you on that. So I'll be posting a more detailed announcement, hopefully on coming Friday, because I'm still waiting for like, you know, some question to be reviewed. Like, you know, by our TAs, because it's important that we get their input too. If the questions are perceived too difficult, we don't include them. Yeah, so once I have, like, you know, everything figured out, I'll get back to you. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions, people? Also, I know the lecture was a little bit heavy today. We had, like, you know, a good part. That's why I discussed inequality first, and then we went to yeah, the second part, so that we leave it on the ecological or the green or the happy note rather than on the inequality note. So yeah. Any other questions, people? Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, have a great start of the week. I'll have my office hours tomorrow from 1 p.m. till 3 p.m. The link is the same. It's posted on your Zoom. So please feel free to, yeah, stop by. And if you have any additional question, please let me know. Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye now. Bye.